Hello, everyone. I was about to say good afternoon, but then I realized there are those who need good evening and others who need just good morning. So, hello, everyone. We welcome you and we're very happy to have you with us for the event, which is long anticipated, very much expected, but still beautiful, important, and critical for the pedagogy of the American world today. I'm talking about the humanistic and holistic approach to education developed by Vasily Sukhomlynsky. You see behind me the facade of the old building. That's his school. That's the school which I visited together with my students. That's the school where he worked 22 years of his life immediately after the war, starting from 1948, and then until the very day of his death in September 1970. Sukhomlynsky lived in comparison with American standards today a very short life. He died before he reached 52. Here, it's considered dying young. But how many people dying at the age of 100 can boast of writing about 40 books, about 1,000 papers published in different languages, and his books as of now, were translated into 55 languages. Who can boast of being a school principal, working every day with teachers and children, also teaching a kindergarten class, also teaching in high school, and also presenting at different conferences, having a PhD degree, and many, many other things. So he was unique. At the same time, he looked very shy, very quiet. He was never a charismatic leader the way we are used to thinking about charismatic leaders, but he was very present. And when in the late 1980s, I visited, published together with my students, almost 20 years after his death, his presence in the village, not to say in the school, was everywhere. People remembered him, people knew about him, people were talking about him with admiration. We visited the cemetery, the local cemetery. The gravestone was full of fresh flowers. First time I started talking about Sukhomlynsky to the American school principals in 1990, when actually participating in my first American conference at the University of Notre Dame. By coincidence, Adasha Nervais, who is facilitating this event together with me, is also professor at the University of Notre Dame. Anyways, the pre-conference workshop was specifically for school principals, and I was asked to talk about someone who is most important and critical in the pedagogy of Soviet Russia. I spoke about Sukhomlynsky, and I saw the eyes and the astonishment of 50 plus school principals in the room. They were really stunned with the ideas. The question came then, and the question which was asked many, many times afterwards, whenever I mentioned his name and his pedagogy, people keep asking why we never heard of him, why he's not part of the curriculum in American universities, why we never read him, why, what's happening. Without further ado, I want to give the floor to Sukhomlynsky himself. We'll watch a short documentary about him, and we'll see him there. Ellen managed to put subtitles in English, so you will see and you will hear and you will understand what he's talking about. Okay, let's start.
Нет, наверное, ни в одной школе. А в этой сельской есть. тише. Идет урок мышления.
Красиво яблоко. Що це таке?
Еще вопрос. Что это такое? Цветок, отвечают дети. Вот посмотрите на цветок, говорит учитель, и на песок. Сравните, чем они отличаются. Только не спешите, говорит он. Думайте, думайте все. Нина говорит, песок желтый, а цветок белый. Только ли в этом различие? Нет, возражает Сережа. У песка нету корней, а у цветка есть корень. Нина добавляет, песок не живой, а цветок живой. Думайте же теперь, чем отличается живое от неживого, спрашивает учитель. Песок и корень, живое и мертвое. Вы задумывались над этим? Вы спешите, вам некогда. Мы привыкли получать от общества все в готовом виде, и хлеб, и знания. И зачастую угасает великий дар природы – любознательность.
Ми стурбувалися тим, що великий і всезростаючий потік інформації
Педагога волнует, что огромный и всевозрастающий поток информации несет в себе угрозу. Знания, которые получает ребенок с экранов телевизора, кинотеатров, со страниц журналов, зачастую не являются толчком для мысли. И он старается развивать любознательность. Дети, посмотрите, кто тут живет? Пчелы живут. А что у них в ульях есть? Что еще?
От як ти кажеш, що там?
Маленькі бджоленята.
Маленькие пчеленята. Хорошо Нина сказала. Но скажите мне, как пчелы узнают, куда им лететь? Вот летят они далеко в поле.
По сонцю.
Вони запам'ятовують, на якому боці сонця, і вони туди летять.
Можна і так сказати. Бджола запам'ятовує. з якого
Можно и
боку
так сказать. Они запоминают, с какой стороны солнце, и так находят дорогу к полям, где много цветов. Внимание детей подстегивают неожиданные вопросы. А скажите мне, сколько месяцев живет пчела? Ну, Вася, скажи. 2 месяца живет пчела. А улей сколько живет?
Завжди живе був. Завжди живе був.
Правильно. Всегда живет улей. Вот это и есть жизнь.
Що таке уроки мислення? Це, я б сказав,
На вопрос о том, что такое урок мышления, педагог ответил так. Это, я бы сказал, путешествие к первоисточнику мысли и слова. Ребенок возвращается с такого урока с бесчисленными вопросами. Именно потому, что он видит непонятное, осмысливает непонятное, у него возникает желание узнать и понять. А это и есть то, что мы называем любознательностью человека. Удивление будет мысль. Мысль порождает вопросы. Почему? 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 И пробуждается фантазия.
Sukhomlynsky is an inspirational figure. He began working as a teacher at the age of 17 and continued teaching until he died just short of his 52nd birthday. For the last 22 years of his life, he was the principal of a combined primary and secondary school in the rural settlement of Pavlish in central Ukraine. He was more than a principal, however. He was an educator who inspired a whole village and ultimately inspired teachers throughout his nation and beyond. Sukhomlynsky was a reflective practitioner who wrote extensively about his experience. He used to get up at 4 a.m. and write his articles and books until 8. At 8 o'clock, he would go to the school entrance and greet all the students as they arrived. During the school day, he taught Ukrainian language, worked with a preschool group of children aged 5 to 6, and mentored teachers, as well as being responsible for the administration of the school. After school, he was involved in a very extensive extracurricular program and ran a program to educate parents about child development and child psychology. Sukhomlynsky's books are very readable. I would recommend that school teachers begin by reading his masterpiece, My Heart I Give to Children. It describes Sukhomlynsky's work with a group of 31 children over a period of 5 years. As a school principal, he missed having his own class, and he decided to start a preschool group, which he taught himself. He invited parents in the area to send their children to school a year early, when they were 6 years old. He assured parents that this would not cut short their childhood, and he developed a very creative program for children that was run almost entirely outdoors. The children came to school barefoot and roamed the countryside with notebooks and pencils, which they used to draw pictures, and later to write sentences about what they saw. This outdoor program involved a great deal of walking and physical activity and developed health and resilience. Sukhomlynsky also used the natural environment to stimulate children's observation and thought, telling them stories about what they saw and asking them questions. Soon the children were making up stories of their own, which eventually they learned to write down. Sometimes they rescued injured wildlife and cared for it. Sukhomlynsky also taught them how to fashion a folk pipe from the branch of an elder tree and how to make music with it. Just about the only time they spent indoors was in a fairy tale room set up with props created by older children, and in an animal hospital they set up at school, and when visiting members of the community. Sukhomlynsky made a point of introducing the children to elderly citizens in the community who needed companionship. The whole preschool program was very engaging, emotionally and artistically. When the children enrolled in the primary school, Sukhomlynsky continued to work with them and made sure they still spent a good deal of time outdoors in nature. We can learn what it was like being a student at Sukhomlynsky's school from another book I have recently translated, which has been published under the title Our School in Pavlish. This describes how the educational program at Pavlish Secondary School was run. The school was in fact a combined primary and secondary school with about 500 students from the surrounding area. Over the 22 years that Sukhomlynsky was principal, his staff became a tightly knit group with a shared philosophy of education. The approach was holistic, addressing a wide range of developmental needs: physical, emotional, intellectual, artistic, vocational, and spiritual. The school had close ties with the parent body and the wider community. Parents attended sessions twice each month where they learnt about their children's developmental needs and could get advice from senior teachers. The local collective farm and industrial enterprises gave financial support to the school. The local doctor gave the children health examinations 2 years before they commenced school and continued to monitor children's health throughout their schooling. Through Sukhomlynsky's involvement with the preschool group and his close ties with families, and through the united approach taken by the staff, children were trained to rise early in the morning and to do their homework before school. This left them with a great deal of free time after school for extracurricular activities. The extracurricular program was very extensive and very significant. It gave children the opportunity to develop knowledge and skills in a very broad range of activities that included horticulture, agriculture, animal husbandry, woodwork, metalwork, electronics, art, singing, instrumental music, ceramics, poetry, creative writing, local history, puppetry, and a range of extension activities related to mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and other subjects offered in the school curriculum. Often these clubs and activity groups involve children of varying ages, and the older children passed on their knowledge to younger children. Talents and abilities flourished, and children developed the habit of pursuing knowledge autonomously, becoming lifelong learners. The extracurricular program also offered staff an opportunity to form close relationships with children in an informal atmosphere. Students at Sukhomlynsky School were taught to appreciate the beauty of nature and to protect and care for the natural environment. They were also explicitly taught how to read the emotions of their friends and family members and to develop empathy. There was a strong emphasis on developing positive values and positive relationships. During their first year at school, children planted an apple tree for each of their parents and grandparents, which they tended for years. The first fruit borne by these trees were proudly presented to the family member for whom they were grown. Children were taught to find happiness through being creative and through bringing happiness to others, rather than through consumption or the accumulation of wealth. The whole education program fostered the qualities of curiosity, empathy, and creativity, and was deeply rooted in the natural environment. I believe it could be taken as a blueprint for education in the 21st century. I believe English translations of Sukhomlynsky's books should be in every school and university library, so that today's educators have the opportunity to be inspired by his example and to glean creative ideas from his writings.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Thank you again, Ellen. It was very inspirational and very informative. And now we turn to the part which is questions and answers, and Dasha and I will facilitate it, but the floor is all yours, and everybody who is present today, please place your questions in a chat box or ask them directly. We can proceed with that.
Alan, I have a question. I wonder if you missed some parts of the book when translating it to the Western readers. Yes. I mean that Sukhomlynsky was a communist, and he became a member of the Communist Party when he was at the front of the Second World War and the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union. And there are a lot of parts in his books, and in the book you translated about Polish secondary school, there are also parts of communist ideology that is taught to children. Have you left them in the book, or just put the dots when you were talking about his views on, well, there are a citing of Lenin and other people. Yeah.
Yes. I'll talk about both books because My Heart I Give to Children is quite interesting too in that respect. With My Heart I Give to Children, Sukhomlynsky's daughter, Olga Vasilyevna, went to the archives and located the original 1966 manuscript of My Heart I Give to Children. And she produced a new edition where she showed exactly what was in the original manuscript, what Sukhomlynsky had been forced to add to it, and what he'd been forced to cut out of it. So with My Heart I Give to Children, I followed the 1966 manuscript. So that means compared to the 1969 edition, the first Russian language edition, some of that ideological stuff was left out. And also that there was other material added where, for instance, he referred to Freud, or he quoted from Walt Whitman, or he described how difficult it was for children after the war. So with that one, I've stuck very closely to the 1966 edition. I did leave out about 2 pages There was one page where he attacked an American educator who probably no one in America had ever heard of. And I thought that's not going to be any use to anyone. It will only put people off. And there may have been something else, but it was, there wasn't much I left out anyway. With Pavlish Secondary School, translated as Our School in Pavlish, I didn't have an original manuscript. There wasn't a new edition to guide me, but I did leave out about 20,000 words out of 170,000. I translated the whole thing, and then I said, okay, I didn't cut out when he's talking about communist ideals, because that's part of his soul. So if he's talking about how they planted communal grapevines and how they were trying to show communism in real life through sharing, and then I left all that in. But if he's referring specifically to Communist Party conferences, or he's put in obligatory references to Lunacharsky and Krupskaya, I've tended to leave that out. And I left out a whole section. There was a whole passage on social orientation where it was quite interesting, because the students were involved in heated discussions about how they could be like Pavlik Morozov, but the whole terms of reference were just so foreign. I thought if anything, it's going to put people off. So there were, in published secondary school, I did leave out more of the strictly ideological stuff, and stuff that would not be relevant to an American audience or English or Australian audience. So I tried to package it in a way that the essential ideas were there and not much was left out, excuse me, but that those things that might put people off, I left out. So if there are scholars who are especially interested in the history of Soviet education, want the full version, I'm happy to send them the full version, which I have translated. But the published version at this stage does leave out some material. Excuse me.
Thank you.
Rupert Collister gives us one of I'm sorry, one of the quotes he loves. A person is being truly educated only when they pass their knowledge, experience, and mastery on to someone else. One only begins to sense one's creative powers and abilities when one enters into moral relations with another person and becomes concerned with increasing their spiritual wealth.
Yeah. And so thank you for that. I did highlight moral relations, but it didn't come through in the text box there. But you know, I think so much of Sukhomlynsky's writing is so powerful. I mean, I've been, as I say, a fan for a long time of Alan's work in this area. And that quote has really guided my own teaching ever since I read it in, what was it, 2000 or something, after Each One Must Shine.
Alan, can you say something about his emphasis on spirituality? Can you say something
Yes.
about that? Because
Yeah.
I think we associate communism with kind of anti-religion, anti-spirituality. That's very much not the case.
And Sukhomlynsky's idea of spirituality would not be the same as a Catholic monk or a yogi either, probably. But he uses the word a lot, and in Russian usage, spirituality refers to all of a person's moral dimension, their aesthetic appreciation, higher psychological functions, I suppose you could say, something like that. So it isn't used in a religious sense, but if you look at Sukhomlynsky's life and his personal example, and if you look at his feeling for nature, And if you look at the poetry that his children wrote about nature in My Heart I Give to Children, it's hard to think, I think spirituality is an appropriate word to use describing that, even though Sukhomlynsky himself was an atheist. And I think there is such a thing as secular spirituality, and even Buddhism is not theistic. So I think he's a very spiritual person, and I think he encouraged spirituality in his students, but not in the sense of a religion, of promoting a religion. Yes. So I don't know whether you want to take that further or reflect on it yourself, Dasha, but.
No, that's my impression. So it's being connected to a higher power, the natural world, the community. So
certainly nature, yes. Yes, certainly nature. There's an interesting, he wrote, as Tatiana mentioned, he wrote over 1,000 stories, little miniatures. Not all stories, some of them are more like vignettes. They're just descriptions of nature, or but one I liked was called The Lamplighter. Excuse me. And it's about this river that flows through the countryside and how boats sail on this river and people live on it. And then he describes, and there's a lamplighter who goes out, there's a post in the middle of the river, and they hang lamps there at night for the boats to navigate their way down the river. But then people decide that the forests along the riverbank are not necessary. They could use that land for agriculture, and they chop down the forests. And gradually they exploit more and more of the landscape to the point that the river dries up. And people use the riverbed for vegetable gardens. And this lamplighter still keeps going out and putting his lamp up on the lamppost. And someone asks him, he says, "Why do you keep putting that lamp up? There's no river there anymore." And he says, "So people can see their stupidity." And so he was an environmental advocate back in the 50s and 60s, probably, I don't know if it was before or after Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, but certainly he was a very early environmentalist. And in an article that his daughter recently wrote, she mentioned some correspondence with a science fiction writer, and Sukhomlynsky had written in this letter, he said, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're not going to have air to breathe. And he was very much aware of our connection, our dependence on the natural environment. And he said people should have the attitude to the soil that a submariner has to the walls of his submarine. Their life absolutely depends on the health of it. So yes, nature was probably, the supreme thing for him.
And nature was in connection with his, again, different concept of being a patriot, because there's so much now happening in countries where he was born and he was working, talking about patriotic education. For him, homeland was the beginning of life in a small place where you are born. Homeland for him was that small community where a person belonged to. It's not about hugely patriotic slogans, which is another different thing in comparison with the Soviet schools of the time. Like every Soviet school would start with, we would fulfill the decisions of Communist Party Congress number such and such. And then numbers would be changed every 4 or 5 years. But his school would start in the lobby of the school, even at the time when we were visiting it 18 years after his death. The school started with the portraits of mothers of great people. So for him, a mother is the start or the homeland for a child. And this kind of respect and love, which school should instill in every child, the feeling to the mother, to the person who gave birth to, is so very important and practically doesn't exist in our schools today. When we talk with children, we talk about different things, which are like big terms and big concepts, but we forget most natural and most fundamental, like love to your family, to your mother. And as I said before, and I think that's a very important melody, if you wish, in each of his stories and books, that is how to actually develop a loving and caring person. But if you are not prepared to love and care for your close family, like your mother, your grandparents, your parents, then how would you be prepared to care for the world, for the society? So this motif, if you wish, is very, very important. And I think this is something which should be taken and brought very widely to our schools today. This is something which is lacking today, right? Anyways, other questions?
I can see a couple.
Yes. Yeah,
I can. Some of them are. There's one from Laurie Wright asking about whether Sukhomlynsky's work might be relevant to working with marginalized adults. So I might comment on that. Partly because Sukhomlynsky did take an interest particularly in juvenile offenders, and he visited prisons and corresponded with people in prison. I suppose I don't know a lot about that, but I can imagine that his personal qualities would have had an effect on people he met with, and that he would have been one of the things he wrote about people who ended up in prison was often they had very impoverished childhoods in terms of what they were exposed to in the way of literature or culture or so I imagine he would have been doing anything he could to expose those people to some values and to some culture. But I think every educator has to work creatively in the context in which they find themselves. So there wouldn't be anything you could say that this particular technique's going to work or that's going to work. It would come down to the relationships that you built with those people and their individual circumstances and what was going to help them, and a certain amount of intuition and empathy. And Sukhomlynsky wrote in one of his books just about schooling that a method that's appropriate in one case will be neutral in another case and absurd in a third. It just depends so much on the individual person and the individual situation. So I think probably the main thing that someone might get from reading Sukhomlynsky would be maybe to learn from his faith in every single student. He would never write anyone off. And from trying to empathize with those people and listen to them and respond to them and give them the attention that they need. There's a couple of questions about books. So all the books that I've talked about that I've translated are available on Amazon or from other online bookstores or to be ordered through your local bookshop. And I'll send out some information about those, and I'll talk a little bit about it at the end. the stories that he wrote, someone says, I wonder if they resemble some of Tolstoy's. I've only published 19 of his little stories to date. And the next volume that I'm working on will be a larger collection of his stories. So hopefully in another year or two, we'll have a volume of those. But in the meantime, I've probably translated, I've had a newsletter that's been going for about 70 issues, and I translate about 4 in each newsletter. So there would be probably something like 300 stories available online if you download back issues of my newsletter, which you can subscribe to and which I'll talk about at the end as well. And some of them are like Tolstoy's stories. There's always a moral point to them, or some of them are more like poems about nature.
Ellen, there's a question coming from Sasha. Could you describe Sukhomlynsky's interaction with those with exceptionalities?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, exceptionalities can be, of course, being gifted, and it can be having difficulties. And in both cases, Sukhomlynsky catered to those individual differences. So the gifted children, as Dash has already mentioned, the emphasis on self-education. So for the gifted children, there were all these extracurricular activities so that just about everyone would find something that they were passionate about. And Sukhomlynsky makes the point it's not always going to be academic things. So he thought it was very important to find what he called a person's golden vein. That's the image of mining gold, when you find a vein of gold in quartz or somewhere. He mentions a case of a student who was struggling with their studies, but it turned out they were an absolute genius at grafting fruit trees. So that even experienced nurserymen wondered at how they managed to do what they did. So part of it was finding what people were really good at. And then there were students who really struggled. And he writes quite a bit about that as well. And he even published a volume, or there's been a separate volume published that gathers together material on that. It's called Difficult Children. So firstly, I think he wanted to make it concrete for these children. So he would take them out into nature and they would observe things. And Sukhomlynsky said with some of these children, they find it very difficult to switch from one thought to another, to make associations between things. So he would get them to observe nature and to observe cause and effect relationships in nature and make connections. And then he'd teach them how to talk about these things. And someone who, there might be someone who for 2 years couldn't work out addition, but through taking them out and giving them all this concrete experience, eventually something clicked. I think there was one child he wrote about who invented a machine. He was in one of these work clubs, in these extracurricular activities after school, and they were making gadgets that could be used for addition. And in working on this gadget, it clicked what addition was. And he was able, and he said that boy actually went on to become one of the most gifted math students by the time he graduated from high school. So I think one thing that characterizes Sukhomlynsky's approach is that he would never give up. And he never gave a child in the primary school a failing grade. If they hadn't achieved what would be a pass, they just kept working at it until they did. So sometimes a child might take a report card home that had no mark recorded in some subjects. And the students and the parents realized that this needed to be worked on, but the child was never told you're a failure. So always they were given another chance to do work again, to repeat it again, to keep going, to keep trying. And he would never give up. And I think that's probably a pretty good strategy to take with children that have difficulties.
Yeah, and there's one more question from Sasha. What were the average sizes of those classes he worked with?
Sukhomlynsky's classes at his school, I think, were around 30, probably. They had 10 classes, 10 grade levels, grades 1 to 10. Grades 1 to 4 was primary and grades 5 to 10 was secondary. And I think there were probably, I'm guessing there were 2 classes at each level because there were about 500 or 600 students. And the preschool group he started with was 31. So there may have been larger classes. I've certainly, when I went to school in the 60s, we had 40 in a class at the primary school I went to. So, but I think he had around 30 at his school. I don't know, Tatiana, if you've got any comment to make about that.
That's correct. And also I wanted to add that he was the first educator in the Soviet Union who suggested to have this one class before the first class, like the first grade, so age 6 to 7, what he calls the school under the blue sky, the school which he created. For 9 months, kids would be having classes, but practical all the time in nature. But he was the first to suggest it. So now in Ukraine, they do start at the age of 6. But before that, Sukhomlynsky was the first, especially in a village school, to start doing it. And also, I wanted to add about the children. Remember, that is Ukraine immediately after the Second World War. So Ukraine was under fascists for over 2 years, and practically all Ukrainian villages were burned. So what Sukhomlynsky received as a school principal was almost nothing. And most of these kids did not have fathers. Some lost both fathers and mothers. So they were difficult children in this regard. They were difficult because they didn't have parental love. Some lived with one grandmother or grandfather, and there were several children and no money at all. So in this regard, they are all under the rubric or category, what we call here, children at risk. But what he managed to make out of these children at risk is a beautiful group of young adults who then gave birth to their children. And this publisher was flourishing at the time he was school principal. And also there was a music school in the village, and it's practically part of his school. So aesthetics and the understanding of beauty as is was a big part of the school. And when you think of a child who is raised in the spirit and atmosphere of beautiful moral relations and beauty as is, then the result is as it was, beautiful.
There's one other question there. What was his approach to discipline that probably needs a comment? So firstly, there was certainly no physical punishment. And Sukhomlynsky, he was an extremely disciplined person himself, and he expected his students to develop self-discipline. So he certainly had high expectations of his students and of his teachers. But one of his quotations was, you can't force someone to think a certain way. I'm paraphrasing. And he quotes Tal's story. He says, trying to force someone to accept your beliefs is like trying to cover the rays of the sun. Whatever you put on them, they come out on top. So his whole approach to character development was to lead by example, to give explanations, to motivate people emotionally. There's a couple of incidents in My Heart I Give to Children which illustrate his approach. One is where the children in his preschool group visited part of the school grounds where they'd planted all these flowers, all these chrysanthemums, and the children started picking them. And Sukhomlynsky let them keep picking, even though he knew it wasn't right. And then when they'd picked most of them, he said, "Now, children, does it look nice now?" And he made them aware that the other children had put a lot of work into growing those flowers, and now that beauty was gone. He said, "If you want to pick a flower, you should plant 10. So then they transplanted the chrysanthemums into the greenhouse, and they grew them there so they could give their mothers chrysanthemums in March. I did have another example, but I see also we're running out of time.
Can you, there were a couple of questions about his impact today in Ukraine, I suppose, or elsewhere, but can you say something about that?
Certainly his writings are still very popular in Ukraine and in Russia. And a lot of his works were translated into Chinese during the 1980s and 1990s. And when I visited Ukraine in 2009, I found out that they were selling a huge amount of his work in China. And I read a paper by a Chinese scholar that suggested that Sukhomlynsky was the most popular foreign educator in China. And they give the biggest volume of his works published in Russian is a 5-volume collection, and each volume is about 600 pages, so about 3,000 pages. And that's selected works, of course, that's not complete works, but and that's been translated into Chinese, and they give it as a prize to teachers who perform very well. So, and I went to a conference in China where there were 400 school principals, and there'd been another conference I heard of where there were 1,000 delegates came to study Sukhomlynsky's approach. And there are schools, especially country schools, that are modeled on his school. So outside the English-speaking world, he certainly is influential. I imagine a lot of his work would have been translated into the languages of the countries that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc. So probably he's known in countries like Poland and Hungary. Sukhomlynsky visited Hungary, East Germany, and Cuba, and gave lectures there. So I don't know to what extent his legacy survived in those countries, but I imagine, given its universal appeal, or as it seems to me, its universal appeal, that he would still be read in those countries. And I think he remains to be discovered by most educators in English-speaking countries, and I hope people do read the books and learn from them. So I've got a little PowerPoint I made, which just shows the publications that are that I've currently made available, and perhaps I could share that. And I thought I'd send out a PDF I've generated from it to all the participants so that they can access those books if they want to, and perhaps ask their libraries to get them in. So I'll share screen again. PowerPoint, share.
While Ellen is doing it, I wanted to remind you that in Sukhomlynsky's pedagogy, a very important part is a teacher as a role model. And I think this is totally missing today from our current pedagogy, because if a teacher is not really the person who they can take example from and just look at as a moral example, then it's difficult to educate children in a moral spirit. So he himself was such an incredible moral exemplar that it worked in his hands. But it doesn't mean that if you take his system and bring it to some ordinary school, it will immediately give positive results, because you need teachers and school principal working in this spirit and being such. And that's difficult. That's quite an accomplishment. There's another question here. How had the children gone on in their adult lives? I don't know much about it other than, as I said, they didn't want to leave the village. They stayed in the village and worked there. And that's a big result by itself, being countryside children. In the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, a village living was not considered the best type of living. So many children were leaving, many graduates. His was staying there. Ellen, yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, so the main books are My Heart I Give to Children, which I would say is the best starting point for teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's Our School in Publish, the one that I've just translated, which would be of particular interest to principals and anyone that wants an overview of how his system works.
Mm-hmm.
Each One Must Shine is my book about Sukhomlynsky, which summarizes, gives a bit of his biography and his influence on other educators, and summarizes his main ideas. A World of Beauty, that's the one that has 19 little stories in, illustrated by students from Ukraine. And then there's the newsletter, which anyone can subscribe to. And if you Google Sukhomlynsky, spelled Sukhomlynsky, you will find my sites. So you'll find there's a site called The Holistic Educator. And there's also a little bit of information there about Tolstoy and Korczak, the Polish educator, who are also interesting. They were people that influenced Sukhomlynsky. And as I say, there's a lot of back issues there that contain a lot of material that I've translated of Sukhomlynsky's, including a lot of his little stories. And if you subscribe to the newsletter, then you'll keep getting new stuff each month that as I translate. So that's what's available. And as I say, I've generated a PDF from this PowerPoint, which I'll email to everyone. If you don't get it, I think I emailed everyone yesterday practically with the login details. So if you don't receive, I'll send out a bulk email again. If you don't get it, just email me and I'll send it to you individually. So thank you very much for coming, and to Dasha and to Tatiana for facilitating and lending their voices to mine to recommend Sukhomlynsky's work to English-speaking educators, and to everyone who's set aside the time to participate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's just marvelous. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, and thank you to everyone. And if there are some urgent questions, I'm available, and I guess Alan as well.
That's right? Yes, I'm retired from teaching. I've got time to respond to any emails from anyone who's interested in Sukhomlynsky. So any questions you have, you're free to just email me directly to my personal email and I'll respond.
Or we can stay for a little longer, because this Zoom event is still available for us. And if someone, I mean, we understand people have other responsibilities in life. So if you need to go. Thank you for being with us. But if you want to stay and you have other questions, I guess we can still do it, right, Ellen?
Oh, yes. Graywind's could you please read a story from A World of Beauty? So, yes.
Ellen, maybe stop share, Ellen.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
And I will be leaving to go make dinner. So
thank you, Dasha. Bye-bye.
Dasha, thank you. Have a good evening.
So, yes, I'm happy to read that story. I'll show the illustration first. This is by a 16-year-old boy, I think. The illustration of the birds there. In English, they're called waxwings, these birds. And I'll just read. The story is called Who the Rowan Tree Was Waiting For. And I suppose it's an exemplar of how Sukhomlynsky made up stories about things in nature. The rowan tree shed its leaves. Only bunches of red berries remained. They hung like beads, beautiful, but bitter and tart. Whenever birds came and tried the berries, they found them bitter and flew on. Then one morning, a beautiful song rang out above the rowan tree as if silver strings were being played. Some wonderful crested birds had arrived. They were waxwings. They had flown from the far north. They were the ones the rowan tree had been waiting for. Joyfully, she welcomed her guests with her red berries. None of the other birds knew the rowan tree's berries had become sweet. People say frost makes the berries sweet, but it was not the frost. It was grief. The rowan tree had waited so long for her dear guests, feeling sad, grieving, worrying that they would not come, and its grief made the berries sweet. So that's a sample of one of his little stories.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. I just wanted to mention one more thing, which I remember years ago struck me really. He was using colors and children could show their mood with a color, and they would choose a flower in the morning of a certain color to show their mood. So he once came to the classroom to give a class, and there was some beautiful, colorful flower there in a vase, and it was showing that children were in a very positive mood. During the class, they noticed that he had a hand watch, and the children were looking at his hand watch, and he said, "Are you interested?" So he showed it to the children, and he took it off, put on the table, and was giving a class. During the break, before going out to a recession, he took away the watch from the desk, put it on, and when he came back to the second class with the same group, he noticed that the color of the flower was changed, and the color was showing that the children were not in real positive mood. And he tried to understand why, and he had quite some thinking given, and then he asked the children, and what he realized, the children finally told him that the mood was changed because they realized he did not trust them with his watch. He took it away during the recession. He did not trust that they would take care of his watch, or maybe stole his watch. So the children had all these very transparent ways to show how they felt about the teacher, even at a very early age. And I don't think things like this happen in our public schools today. Like, the teacher is open to the children's expression of how they feel about the teacher. This ability to give feedback to the teacher is so extremely important, I think. And that's another example of his pedagogy. Any other questions?
question, but a few words to Alan and to Tatiana and to Dasha for organizing this, well, very exciting for me meeting. And thank you, Alan, for your tremendous work. And you see, I have been studying Janusz Korczak, the legacy of Janusz Korczak, and I know how difficult it is to work on the texts of the person you are interested in. And I was not translating his books from Polish into Russian, but still your work is really fantastic. Thank you very much. I feel very much fascinated today. And I will tell my students, I'm going to have my lecture on Sukhomlynsky very soon to my first year students, student teachers. And I will say that there is a person whose name is Alan Cockerill, who translated from Russian and from Ukrainian into English his works. And it is really very, very, very important that Sukhomlynsky will be known in the English language world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is very early in Russia now. It's 1:30 a.m. and that's why I think I have to go to bed.
Yes, that's a heroic effort.
Thank you, Rosa, and good night. Thank you.
Body.
Yeah, and, Ellen, I have a question which I dare ask finally. How did you come to Sukhomlynsky originally? Why did you start working at him on his books?
Well, it's quite a long story. I suppose the first thing is that I studied Russian at school. I was lucky I got a scholarship to a very good school in Melbourne in Australia where they taught Russian. It was one of only 8 schools in Victoria that taught it. Now I don't think there are any schools that teach Russian. It was lucky it was in the 60s when there was more interest in with the Cold War and the space race and everything else. Then when I was at university, I studied Russian and I did an honours degree in Russian language and literature. And I was also studying, as an extracurricular activity, I was studying yoga. And through yoga, I became interested in holistic approaches to education. Mm-hmm. And then I trained as a school teacher. And I was involved with a foundation that was starting up a holistic school. And I put my Russian aside for a while, and I worked in some bakeries that were raising money for the school, and I worked on a farm for a couple of years. And then I went back to study. I did a master's degree in Russian translatorship, and then I decided I'd do a PhD on Russian education. By that time, I was interested in holistic approaches. I thought I'd combine the two things, my Russian and education. And I started subscribing to Uchitelskaya Gazeta, the teacher's newspaper, and to a couple of journals, Narodное образование and Sovetskaya Pedagogika I subscribed to. And I started reading Simon Soloveitchik's articles, and he often referred to Sukhomlynsky. Mm-hmm. And then I was in a Russian language bookshop in Melbourne, and they had a 5-volume collection of his works on the bookshelf. Mm-hmm. So I picked off one of these volumes and just started reading. And as you know, if you read in Russian, there's a certain flavor you pick up straight away. There's something about his writing that really grabs you, and you say, gee, this man is really special, and what he's saying is really important. And before I picked up that book, I had been going to write just about the Soviet approach to moral education. But once I started reading his work, I thought, no, I'll just write about him. And that's since then I've been interested in his work. So I wrote the PhD and I managed to get it published as a book. And then I went, the Russian department where I was teaching almost closed. It went from 5 lecturers to 1.5. And I went back to school teaching, and I found it difficult to find time to do much research or translation. But I worked in 2009. I cut back my teaching hours a bit, and I went over to Ukraine. And then in 2015, I took long service leave and worked on My Heart I Give to Children. So, and now I've retired. I've got more time, so I completed published secondary school. And I have written a few articles and book chapters about him, but I think the most important work is just the translation, really. And that's what I hope to focus on for the next couple of years, just get more books translated.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. A beautiful story. And, you know, when now with our multimedia showcase, we launched, and Marilyn is here as well, we launched a project which is called International Expressions of Kindness. And Alan is a coordinator for Australia, and Rosa is a coordinator for Russia. So I really looked into Sukhomlynsky's works and how this is related to kindness, how Sukhomlynsky so much time ago, so long ago, was talking about kindness as one of the most important treasures in the world of morality. And I'm thinking, if we return children and young adults to this important value, the world will definitely become better. But when I was looking at different languages, as we have flyers for this project in 14 languages already, I checked which languages we should start translating into. And I can tell you that Russian is among the most massively speaking languages in the world, and English goes way down this same ladder. And unfortunately, English has become Latin of the modern world, as Latin was in the Middle Age. And this is not a very good thing to do. We need different languages, but as the situation it is as it is now, it's very, very important that there are educators like Alan who spend so much time and give so much effort to translate from English, from different languages into English, and in this case from Russian. So Ellen, thank you very much indeed, especially from me as a Russian speaking person. I think it's a huge effort and a huge achievement, and you should celebrate it. If you don't have any other comments or questions, I would close the meeting unless anyone wants to say something. I see many thanks coming in the chat box. Thank you for this. And we'll keep working on it. Yeah, and Ellen, I'm sure, will come up with other translations for us. Thank you. Is there anyone who wants to say something or ask a question? You have a chance.
Thank you, Alan. It was a very enlightening presentation, and I'm definitely going to encourage others within my universities to, you know, get involved and understand what it means to really bring in other worldly, you know, takes on when it comes to curriculum development. And as when we think about education this day and age, we often are caught within that colonialistic model here in Trinidad and Tobago. We're still in that model. And so I think that it's about time we get enlightened. So thank you so very much.
Where do you work, Sasha? In what university?
University of Trinidad and Tobago, and I also am a past student of Collister, Rupert Collister. So it's really an honor to be here with you all today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.